Now, Darren, I'm a Visual Studio user. You a Visual Studio user?
Yes, indeed.
I use Visual Studio Code from time to time.
I use Visual Studio Code on both Windows and Mac.
Now, you have a Mac?
I do.
Visual Studio on a Mac?
I actually do have Visual Studio on the Mac.
There are so many things happening to Visual Studio on the Mac. We've got the team to talk to us. That's this episode of DevRadio. Hey, and welcome to the next episode of Microsoft Dev Radio. I'm Jerry. This is Darren.
Hey.
You're a Visual Studio user?
I am.
Finest IDE in the world?
Absolutely.
On Windows?
I also use it on Mac.
Very nice. We have Unni. He's the program manager for Visual Studio on Mac. He's here to talk to us. Unni, thanks for being on the show today.
Hey, thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Darren.
Unni, I think you've been on the show more than absolutely anybody. I've done more MVAs with you than anybody except for Darren. It's kind of crazy. Yeah. Now, Unni, it is possible, I suppose, nobody knows who you are, but also your roles have changed a little bit. Talk to us about who you are.
Right. So I currently lead the Visual Studio for Mac team, and my team builds the tools that, our goal is to enable this amazing, fantastic IDE called Visual Studio on the Mac. And my team builds a variety of the tools that enable developers to build great .NET applications on the Mac.
The Mac has not always been friends with Windows, but now we really bring over that same luxurious experience for developers to the Mac side. Talk to us a little bit about what a developer can expect when they go to Visual Studio on a Mac.
Right. So if you're running Visual Studio on Windows to start with, you get exposure to all of the scenarios, that you probably, if you're a Visual Studio user for a long time, you've come to expect, right? You can build all kinds of Windows applications, WPF, WinForms, etc. But also you can build .NET Core applications, Xamarin applications, etc. Our goal for Visual Studio on the Mac is to enable .NET scenarios that make sense on the Mac. So obviously Xamarin mobile development is one, but we have support for building .NET Core applications. A lot of people don't know this, but the .NET Core population, people building applications that target ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, that population is bigger than people building mobile applications on the Mac. And of course, you can also build games, Unity games, and write code for Unity games inside Visual Studio for Mac as well. So those are our three main target audiences at the moment for the Mac when we talk about Visual Studio.
So it makes sense because we have this much broader cross-platform play now to really bring that premier development experience to one of those cross-platforms.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and the beauty of the whole thing is that all of Visual Studio, almost all of Visual Studio is written in .NET, most primarily in C#. We can leverage all of those investments pretty easily and bring them to the Mac by just layering in, native Mac UI, Cocoa UI, right? So it sort of shows the power, not just from a developer perspective of the kinds of apps you can build for your customers, but also as engineers on the Visual Studio team, we can bring our product from Windows to the Mac in a fairly, amazingly reusable way, and that is pretty fascinating.
That was the early dream of .NET, wasn't it? That you could run it anywhere, and we were like, oh, whatever. But it turns out it's always been true, and we've proven it's true.
Right.
Doctor, let's back up from developers developing for a second, and let's just talk about functionality of Visual Studio. So one of the things that I love on Visual Studio for Windows is the fact that a brand new development environment or a brand new Windows environment, I can install Visual Studio, log in, and it knows me. It knows the things that I like, the settings and the keystrokes and things like that. What's the experience for the Mac developer?
Yeah, so so typically you find yourselves falling into one of two buckets. You have a significant amount of experience on Visual Studio on Windows, and you sort of come to expect similar workflows on the Mac. So that's one audience. And then there is an audience that has heard of Visual Studio before. They probably have or have not used it, and then they are coming to the product. So we have these two classes of people using our product, right? In terms of people who are familiar with Visual Studio and Windows, when they get started on the Mac, the experience looks and feels very similar. You sort of like the installation experience is such that when you install the product, actually the Mac installation experience is simpler because we have lesser scenarios that we need to worry about supporting. You select the workloads that you want to go install, and then the installation is actually pretty quick, and within a few minutes you're building your first .NET Core application. Similar to Visual Studio 2019, there is a start window experience that lets you create and navigate your projects much more quickly. You could choose to sign into the IDE or not. That's your preference. But if you sign in, sure, you sort of get more exposure to functionality that, for example, connects to Azure and so on and so forth, right? So there's a benefit to signing in there. The rest of the IDE looks very similar. Like there's a solution explorer. There's of course the primary core capabilities of writing and debugging code, working with source control. So those experiences look pretty familiar if you're coming from the Windows background. If you don't really have Visual Studio experience, it still is what you'd expect from an IDE. It's a way to get started on your project quickly. There is visual affordances for more complex operations like debugging and publishing to various service-side endpoints. So that experience should feel very easy for you to pick up on. Now, our goal was always to create native Mac experiences. We haven't really taken the Visual Studio Windows experience and just ported it as is. When we talk about porting, it is more to do with like the experiences that make sense. But at the same time, we have layered native Mac UI for the most part, right? So if you are a Mac developer and you have used the Mac before, it should feel fairly familiar for you to get started, even if you have never used Visual Studio before.
Because windowing is one of the things that's different on a Mac than in Windows, for sure.
That's right. But at the same time, the concept of a panel, which we call pads for inside Visual Studio, like the way you dock them and the way you can sort of unhide them and explore. So that should all feel very familiar for someone coming from Windows. And at the same time, if you've never used Visual Studio before, it should be pretty easy to navigate around as well.
Now, another thing that I love in Visual Studio is the easy integration, almost transparent integration into my repositories. It knows GitHub right out of the gate. Do I have the same experience Visual Studio for Mac?
Right. I mean, we are absolutely working on improving that experience, over the next 6 months. But yeah, absolutely, you can connect to your GitHub or any Git backend, download your code, check in, check out. So that experience should be all there. I don't think I'll be super honest that we need to do a lot more in that space to sort of like be really buttery smooth and productive for the developer. But you absolutely can do all of the operations that you'd expect from source control, inside Visual Studio for Mac as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if I'm a CLI guy, I can do a lot of things behind the scenes as well, integrate all the different repositories that I want to.
That's right. And when we have to make a decision on prioritizing a capability, that's really what we, mostly look for. Like, is it an operation that you're more likely to do inside frequently? Or, for example, a good example is branch management, right? You're not really necessarily going to be branching all the time. It is probably okay to fall back to the CLI to do branching, but then you're going to likely want to check in and check out pretty frequently from that branch. So if you had to prioritize branching versus check in and check out, it makes sense to prioritize check in and check out over branching. So it's one of those cases where
is a Mac developer and a Windows developer, do they have some fundamental workflow differences?
Not really. I mean, if you think about Mac-specific tools, let's take Xcode or even Android Studio that happens to exist on Windows and the Mac. I mean, these idioms are actually very consistent. Like you first get code on your machine, and then you sort of like open the solution or folder that contains all these files, and then you start like working against them. So that those are not necessarily concepts that are unique to Windows. I mean, every IDE in the world sort of has that as the foundational basis, and in some ways, Visual Studio for Mac just plays to that.
So that's great. So speaking as like a a developer experience, one of the things that's really powerful on the Windows version of Visual Studio is you're in there, you're writing C# code and so on, and you have Roslyn sitting behind that's doing that on-the-fly analysis of my code, giving me rich IntelliSense and so on and so forth as I'm typing. Do I have a similar experience once I'm in Visual Studio for Mac?
Right, absolutely. So, about a year ago, we had actually finished porting Roslyn onto the Mac as well. So all of the IntelliSense experiences were powered by Roslyn. But what we failed to account for is the fast-moving nature and the value that the community is contributing back to Roslyn. So you could think of us doing about a year ago, what we did is a one-time snapshot, and we sort of like integrated that deeply. We failed to recognize the fact that the ecosystem is going to go very fast and move underneath us. So what we have done over the last 6 months is two things. One, we have made it such that we can, every time Visual Studio ships a new update on Windows, the exact same coding experiences are going to be possible on the Mac as well, right? So that's one big step forward. Like now we can literally integrate Roslyn with the click of a button and get all of the capabilities on Windows on the Mac pretty much with like literally no investment on our part, right? So that's one part. Another part in terms of Roslyn, the way people experience that is via the IntelliSense experience and how they interact with the pixels in the screen, right? So that's another major investment we have done over the last 6 months. We have rewritten all of the editor to basically use Visual Studio's platform. So think about the Visual Studio layering roughly as there is the platform, the editor that provides the APIs, there is Roslyn that sits on top, and then the UI itself, right? The only part that we haven't brought from Visual Studio at this point is the UI, because we wanted to, again, go back to that native, fast and fluid Mac experience. And rest of that, the platform itself and the Roslyn analyzers and capabilities on top are all 100% shared. One big benefit that we got out of this rewrite is not just the analyzers, but things like word wrap support or support for right to left languages, right? A lot of people were complaining that they were trying to read Arabic text or something like that. They just couldn't use the product. Because we were using the Visual Studio platform APIs and bringing them over to the Mac, we got pretty much all these capabilities for free, right? So something as simple as word wrap is actually pretty hard to do in practice, right? Visual Studio had all that, and we got all that on the Mac as well. So that's the benefit of sharing .NET code across these two platforms that we experienced.
Have you found that some of the modifications you've had to do to the things that you brought over from Visual Studio on Windows have actually gone back and helped the Windows side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to take credit, but honestly, the Windows team is doing most of the work there as well, right? We are right now, we are more busy like tailoring that experience for the Mac. A good example is VS for Mac in its old incarnation about a year ago had this capability where you try to import, let's say you try to write some code and the namespace is not imported. You could just you could just type in the class because you remember from your muscle memory, and the IntelliSense would let you complete that namespace, right? So that's a pretty productive experience for writing code that's net new in your code base, right?
Yeah.
That capability did not exist on VS Windows till Visual Studio 2019 Update 1. With Update 2, that capability is being added, right? And so from a Mac user perspective, it's not just all these new capabilities are getting. We are going to retain all of the unique value that was there on the Mac as well. We think of the editor as an experience that can be, that there is no reason to be different between VS Windows and VS for Mac. And we want to make sure that that experience is consistent across the two platforms.
One of the things that on the Visual Studio side, I know a lot of developers enjoy the extensibility of Visual Studio, having different types of extensions that sometimes it's the silliest thing, sometimes it's really important. What's the extension story on Visual Studio for Mac?
So Visual Studio for Mac doesn't have as rich a support for extensions. There are some really good extensions that we have been working, sort of cultivating to closely working with the community. So for example, if you're a XAML editor on the Mac, if you're editing XAML on the Mac for a Xamarin Forms application, you are likely using an extension for helping you be more productive. That could be Mfractor or XAML Styler. So there is the possibility of extending Visual Studio for Mac, but because we are sort of shifting and building the foundation so significantly, we
Yeah.
didn't want to sort of open up Visual Studio for Mac for generic extensions that people could build, because we don't want to break them eventually. So once we get the foundation right, and the consistency with Visual Studio going, it also makes it that much more easier for developers to build extensions, because you're using the same APIs across the two IDEs. We were not there today, and with the work we are doing, we feel like we're moving in the direction where, let's say you're writing an editor extension, that capability or the set of APIs that you use across the two are now going to be much more beneficial for you to leverage, versus writing an extension once for the Mac and then sort of rewriting it again for Windows or vice versa. So
So there are certain types of extensions that you have not have to, but you need to support quickly, because that's the way Visual Studio on Windows is starting to expand. Like even the team is giving IntelliCode or not, IntelliCode and other pieces like that. Those are actually delivered through extensions, and of course you don't want to have to implement those in a different way.
That's right, and the ecosystem provides tremendous amount of value to the Visual Studio developer, right? And you can imagine if you're a Mac developer, you probably want the same ecosystem to be behind you. So I think it's on the roadmap. It's just that we are doing so much heavy lifting right now just to get the foundation rock solid. You'll see us like get there eventually.
So talk to me a little bit about your backlog. So we know that there are some things that are just top of mind for you, and you're probably excited for developers to see these. What's one or two of these things that you know will be coming in the mid to short term?
Right. So the good news is, as we are speaking, I'm also like typing up an update to our roadmap. So I'm going to sort of give you the preview version of what's going to be on the roadmap very soon, right? So
cool.
the big capability that we are adding, or the big set of capabilities that we're adding, is in the code editor experience. So we started off by talking about C#. We talked about a lot of net new value that Visual Studio for Mac developers will see. For example, simple things like go to implementation, that is our number one ask on the Mac. And guess what? That's done, right? Because we get that for free from using Roslyn, so to speak. Two more complicated things like word wrap and RTL. I don't want to pick on this as this reason I'm picking on these is these are pretty hard to get right. And we take that for granted coming from Windows. On the Mac, you get that as well. So
let me pause you for just a second, just because I feel like because you're bringing it over from Visual Studio for Windows, if you're a developer in the Microsoft ecosystem and your boss has just bought you a Mac and you realize that your career is about to take a slight shift, your experience is going to be so familiar to you because you're bringing it over.
That's right. Absolutely. So we talked about the code editor a lot. So our goal is to, like I said, very soon with Visual Studio 2019 for Mac Update 1, which is going to go out sometime early June, I think the C# experience should be pretty good. But that leads us with a gap with some of the other languages, XAML, the web technologies, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, Razor, etc. So that's where we're going to go over the next 3 months. We are bringing the XAML editor for Xamarin Forms from Visual Studio on Windows to the Mac. So, a lot of capabilities that people will start experiencing, things like data binding IntelliSense and things like resource IntelliSense. So all those capabilities that you've always used in the Windows PC, they are also available on the Mac once we sort of bring the language service for XAML. Another big capability is the web editors. We're bringing all of their, for example, with .NET Core 3, and we should talk about .NET Core 3 in just a second, server-side Blazor is going to be a big scenario, and that a lot of the productivity there comes from, the inner loop, the way you write the code, and all of that. So we're bringing the latest web editors from VS Windows to the Mac. That should happen over the next couple months. So once we are done with those three, C#, XAML, and web, we feel like the code editors are something that will feel like really at home if you ever use the recent version of Visual Studio, right? And if you haven't seen Visual Studio for Mac for the last year or so, you will see a huge dramatic improvement. So a Windows user will see what they are already familiar with available on the Mac. If you were a Mac user and haven't really used Visual Studio, now would be a good time to kick tires again and see what your experience is writing some C# code.
So you just actually mentioned .NET 3 or .NET Core 3.
Yeah.
coming along and so on. And obviously that introduces the cross-platform capability. That's obviously what we're leveraging in ASP.NET Core, but we're also starting to see console applications and single file applications and so on becoming part of that ecosystem. But looking forward, we see, we're talking about .NET 5 in November 2020 and so on. So what's that roadmap and how does that align with Visual Studio for Mac?
Great. So first, I'd like to recap by saying, a lot of people think that Visual Studio for Mac basically means mobile development. That's not the case. People can today build .NET Core applications, .NET Core 2.1, 2.2. So we think that experience is actually pretty good inside the Mac, and it's something that people can do today. Talking about .NET Core 3, of course, that is what we are really actively working towards. And I feel like it's exciting for a couple of reasons. One is server-side Blazor as well as WebAssembly's client-side Blazor, right? So those things enable .NET developers to build, bring their skills in very powerful ways to target the browser, right? So that should be super exciting and something that I feel like all .NET developers, if you've ever done .NET before and, sort of we're taking a pause, now's the time to get back in and think about and kick tires again with Blazor, because that scenario is super compelling. The fact that you can write all of your front end in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and the back end for the most part, all the interactivities in C#. In some ways, it's a super compelling experience that we want to also bring to the Mac. C# 8, talking about C# is also right on the horizon. With .NET Core 3, C# 8 will also be out there. We will enable all of the C# 8 capabilities. But going back to our conversation, it's really very little work for us. Click a button, get a new build of Roslyn, and we have C# 8 inside Visual Studio for Mac. So we are actively working on enabling C# 8. In fact, I was just playing with the build today, and we are fully committed to getting C# 8 support out there as well, alongside .NET Core 3. We are lagging a little behind Windows at the moment because we are doing this major re-architecture, refactoring work, but it's just a matter of time before we have C# 8 and VS for Mac as well. So yeah, so those are the two big capabilities. .NET 5 is a way, we have started to look at it, and absolutely we'll have support for that on the Mac. I just don't know what that means at the moment. To me, that is just an incarnation of all the things like, your console app or Blazor or WebAssembly, etc. From a customer perspective, all of those make sense. I don't know enough to speak to what could be beyond that, right? So we are absolutely committed to doing .NET 5 whenever the previews for that start arriving. But at the same time, I don't know what beyond Blazor, how I should think about that from a customer perspective. So something I'm working on learning as well as much as all of you are.
Here's a curious question. So you see all the telemetry around Visual Studio and Visual Studio for Mac, of course, and we're always surprised by what the #1 project on Visual Studio for Windows is. You're like, oh, really? I never would have guessed. What's the #1 project in Visual Studio for Mac?
It's .NET. It's hard to say. Like, it could be a .NET. I'd like to call it as .NET Core all up. It could be a console app or an Angular project or, like a server-side REST endpoint or an Azure function. So I'm bucketing all of that under .NET Core. But yeah, the surprising thing for many people out there would be they would think that it is Xamarin, but it is .NET Core. Xamarin, of course, has a huge population as well, but .NET Core is actually bigger. And, so that's super exciting to see. In fact, Unity is also... Okay, I'll rephrase my thing to say Unity is also actually equally big as .NET Core. So Unity and .NET Core are way out there in terms of the number of people using it. And then, of course, there is the mobile scenarios as well.
There's just no cross-platform gaming. Unity seems to be where it's at for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. From a .NET point of view, the capabilities that I have make me so productive. It's one of those like lovely things. There's a handful of features I get that make me even more productive depending on the SKU. And so, of course, we have, community, personal, and super. It's just enterprise.
Enterprise.
Does Mac follow the same SKU line?
It does, but for all practical purposes, there isn't much of a difference between professional and enterprise. So your decision.
I'm sure really every salesman just cringe.
That's right. In some ways, there are unique capabilities in the product, but for .NET Core, they are equally available everywhere. We don't really have any differentiation for the .NET Core population. So if you're essentially building a .NET Core application, if you qualify for the community SKU, let's say you're doing an open source project, or you're a student, or you're an enterprise that makes less than $1 million or something like that. I don't know the exact license.
That's right.
Terms.
That's for community.
You could definitely use community, or you could use professional, and they'll be identical in experiences.
Yeah. And on Windows, we can install those side by side. On Mac, you can install them side by side as well?
No, that's a capability that we don't have on the Mac at the moment.
Okay.
We are, because things are changing so much, our goal is to, deliver, fast releases to as many of our users as possible. We have had the conversations. We do definitely hear feedback from customers around, in particular when it comes to Xamarin, because they're building these apps that the SDKs need to be, fairly locked down, etc., and they don't want to see an update disrupt their environment. I think that is feedback that is absolutely valid and something we want to look at. But for now, Visual Studio for Mac updates are essentially you get an update, you get the latest, and you stay on the latest. There is no way to use Visual Studio 2017 for the Mac if you are interested in exploring VS 2019 for the Mac.
I understand.
Can you install the RTM version of Visual Studio for Mac and a preview version side by side? Do those exist?
No, you can't. But we have this capability called channels. And you can easily switch back and forth between channels. So if you were trying the Visual Studio 2019 previews, let's say you want to try, just today we made available a bunch of new capabilities such as code editor snippet support. New in terms of these were capabilities that we were in the process of porting over, and now it's all done. So all of those capabilities are available in the preview channel. So if you wanted to kick tires with the preview channel, you can switch to that. And then let's assume that you were to run into an issue and you were not very happy using that product. You can always switch back to the stable channel and get the update back. So it's a very quick operation to switch back and forth. I know it is not as ideal as having both the builds and just switching from the taskbar or the dock.
At least you have an answer.
But you can definitely transition back and forth fairly easily, and we do a pretty good job of like rolling back and moving forward to the release that you're interested in exploring.
Okay, that's great.
Darren, are you a light theme, dark theme, blue theme?
I am a blue theme on Windows, and I believe I actually have my Mac is currently configured using the dark theme.
Is that right? I'm blue theme on Windows myself. Now, this is probably the most important telemetry question of all.
I don't know. That's a great question. VS Mac has, I don't know, like 10 themes or something like that. Oh. Some of the themes are like there's a Visual Studio on Windows theme, and there is a dark theme and a light theme. So yeah, all of this is possible. The other thing, since you hit on this topic, one thing that I frequently hear from customers is, I have this muscle memory of using a particular keyboard shortcut, and I come to the Mac, and suddenly I feel like I have to relearn the shortcuts.
One key too many.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so, this is something that we haven't done a fair job of putting right on the face of users, and so people are not able to discover it. Yeah. But if you go to preferences, you can switch between key bindings, between Mac specific bindings versus Visual Studio on Windows bindings, and a bunch of other IDEs as well. So that lets you, including VS Code, so that lets you pick the key bindings that work best for you. Of course, the Mac is the default, but you can always switch around. We are thinking about exposing that and the theme information more as an option that you pick as you get started.
At the beginning,
you're getting some experience.
And it's a fair discussion to say why you have Mac-specific keystrokes in the first place, but it keeps you consistent across the Mac ecosystem so that users who are accustomed to how to use a Mac come to you, and they're comfortable right away.
Yeah, for example, Android Studio, if you're doing iOS or Android development on the Mac, you're likely also using Android Studio. Then you're sort of thinking about consistency with Android Studio more so than Visual Studio on Windows, right? So it depends upon which kind of project you're working on and what your background is. And so, yeah, absolutely, that's important that we just need to spend some time like exposing and educating people that capability exists.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the Mac, you're always using the Command key, whereas obviously on the Windows world, we're always using the Control key.
Yeah, so
that's one of those big things around muscle memory if you're moving backwards and forwards. But sometimes you can get stuck in this no man's land in between if you actually try and bring the Windows stuff across too much to the Mac, because then as you move to the native applications that are on the platform, your fingers are in the wrong place. It's a tough challenge.
Yeah, for the developer to be able to switch their brain back and
Mhm.
forth. But you know what? That's why they call it work.
Exactly.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, yeah.
go ahead. Sorry, Eddie.
No, I was saying like when we talk about the roadmap, right? We talked about a few things, but
Oh yeah,
there are a
yeah.
couple more things I just want to add out there. So we talked about the C# editor, the XAML editor, the web editors, but there's a couple more that I really wanted to throw out there because clearly it's hurting, right? So one is solution level NuGet package management. So if you, let's say you're building a Xamarin application and you have an iOS application, an Android application, and I give you a NuGet package. Guess what you have to do today? You have to go to the iOS application, install the package there, go to the Android application, do the same operation again. Now an update arrives and you have to do the whole thing again. So clearly this is not an optimal scenario. So we are currently testing an extension and trying to bring that into the product that brings solution level package management. That is a key capability that many people, users, reported as hurting their
Especially for
productivity.
large solutions with lots of projects.
That's right. Another one that we are actively doing, and I've started seeing like some test builds come out, is multi-targeting support. This used to come up quite often. Like multi-targeting was introduced with .NET Core 1, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 1.1, way back in the day, right? And for a couple of years, people have not been able to use Visual Studio for Mac for opening and building and creating such projects. So that's a capability that sort of if you're a team of developers, and you plunk someone in with a Mac right in there, they're going to be blocked because they aren't going to be able to open the project and build the code. So even if we were not to have very advanced tools, just having the ability to like open and build so they can work with the rest of the solution is a huge negative that we have today that we are trying to overcome. And so in over the next 3 months, people should also expect to see multi-targeting support arrive on the Mac inside Visual Studio for Mac.
Well, you are going to be busy over these next 3 months.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, between the editors, solution level package management, and multi-targeting, these are sort of like the headline worthy. Like when you talk to someone with this, they get it, right?
Mhm.
But there's also a lot of the subtle, the we call them paper cuts, in terms of capabilities that just hurt your, like everyone has one of these favorite annoying issues on top of their mind, right? So
That's right.
we're working through those as well. And then finally, we didn't really talk about this because it's not the most glamorous thing, but majority of our investments besides this is going to just basic performance and reliability, like Git, debugger. We want to make sure that those inner loop, as we call them, those experiences that developers do most often are reliable and fast, and really don't get in your way when you want to sort of get your job done. So between all those, I feel like we have a fairly busy summer ahead of us.
Sounds like very busy.
Hopefully, like when you come back from your summer vacation, if you're taking a break, definitely give Visual Studio for Mac a shot, and you'll see some very cool new capabilities in the product.
That's exciting to see the rate of development of these features.
That's right. And the investment that's going into it. So any developer who is wondering whether or not Visual Studio on Mac is for them, they can see the investment we're making.
That's right.
Now, one of the features that I like, Unni, is live share. It's a cool thing now because we can share this development experience. Can my developer colleagues on Visual Studio for Mac look forward to that?
That's a great question. Live share, IntelliCode, and CodeLens are all like top of mind for us, but at the same time, we are not there yet. So I think we need to get like I said,
I keep trying to add work to your backlog.
Yeah, exactly. So it's there on our backlog for sure. But here's another example of something that I think is even more important, like making the product more accessible. We have made great progress over the last 6 months or so, but we need to do a lot more work to be completely compliant with accessibility guidelines. So that for example, trumps live share, because we want to be a product that can be used by everyone, not, so that's an example of an experience that, will trump live share. But at the same time, it is important. I get it, and it's amazing in terms of how productive it can be for two people to collaborate on something. We're just not there, over the next 3 months.
Now, you're working on what the roadmap is going to be, and a lot of our products have a lot of visibility now to our community. Does Visual Studio for Mac have a lot of visibility into the community as well?
When you say visibility, can you elaborate on that in terms
Sure,
of?
yeah. Do you have, for example, sometimes it's comes across as a community call. Sometimes it comes across as just a blog article.
Oh,
Sometimes it's
yes.
even a issues list on GitHub.
Yep. So there are a few things we're doing, and we'd love to engage more and get more ideas on what more we can do. So one is we just started up this thing called a .NET community tooling stand-up.
Okay.
That basically people from Visual Studio, Visual Studio for Mac, Visual Studio Code, and the community, we all show up in a virtual stand-up setting and share learnings that the community has come up with. Like it could be new tools inside the IDE, it could be an extension that somebody built, it could be a solution or an application that somebody built. We try to highlight the tools and how the tools helps the community become more productive. That's one avenue. We are just about kicking off a live coding Twitch session with Jeff Fritz. That's going to happen soon as well. So we'll sort of like go deeper than just the demos, the fancy looking demos we put together, to really using Visual Studio for Mac to doing a real world scenario as a developer would, and hopefully people watching that Twitch stream can experience.
Jeff seems to be permanently on Twitch.
And permanently, I wonder what Visual Studio for Mac is going to look like with a purple goatee.
Exactly.
So we're super excited to partner with him. We tend to think of Visual Studio for Mac as a part of the family of products, right? So we tend to use the Visual Studio blog. We are just about to publish our update 1, and there'll be a blog post that goes out with it. We are just about finalizing the details for a Twitter handle as well. So that'll be live very soon. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely going to build. The reason why we are here is to empower the .NET community. And so, we won't be successful if we are not able to do that. So that's very important to us. And, if there is an avenue that the listeners of this podcast have in mind, I'd love to come and participate, there as well.
Well, I think from time to time you need to have an episode on DevRadio.
Yeah, I think that's key.
Yeah,
that's a key part of the strategy.
Absolutely. I mean, and the other thing is, we want to be where, not just developers with experience on Windows are. We also want to go to places where, Mac native developers are at as well, and try to see if .NET is something that they're interested in, and if so, Visual Studio can really help them, get started and accelerate it on their idea.
Now, here's a really hard question for you, Unni. Is Swift on your backlog?
I mean, that's a good question to ask the Xamarin team, right? Like, I would think that our focus is .NET, and
right.
.NET is our language that we want to sort of rally behind.
That's right.
We want to interoperate with Swift for sure, right? So libraries written in Swift. .NET, if you're writing a code in C#, you want to be able to consume them. So there's an interoperability aspect, right? But our focus in terms of languages still remains .NET. And when I say .NET, I'm using the umbrella for, not just C#, but F# and, Razor and CSS and HTML. And these are not .NET languages, but they are used
complementary
part of the ecosystem.
With, yeah, it's the scenario, right? The scenario is web development, so you have to think about front end and back end. If the scenario is mobile, for us at least, that is C# and XAML. So what can we do there? And of course, you can always do native iOS storyboards. I mean, these days they're talking about Swift UI. That was the new learning from WWDC yesterday. So there's that. But then there is Android XML as well. So there are those native file formats that are required to create a mobile application. That's important to us.
Yeah.
But in terms of programming languages, which is Swift, we feel like .NET is where we want to be at today.
Sure. Well, that's what I would imagine. I was just curious because, hey, we're on Mac. It seems like a thing. Right about now in the show is usually where I say, where could a developer who wants to learn more go? But visualstudio.com is pretty easy to find.
That's right.
Pretty easy to use. Everything's right there.
And then definitely catch up on our blog for the last couple posts that we put out there. If you were to use the Mac, a couple years ago, I think the experience is going to be radically different. In particular, when we are done with our update 1 and update 2 releases, give it a shot and let us know what's not working. And that's the way we're going to know what we need to do.
Every time I hear you say the XAML editor, I think, Unni, we talked about XAML so many times.
It's full circle, right? I mean, in some ways, my team and myself were responsible for building that on the Windows for WPF and
Yeah, I remember, of
then
course.
we brought it for Xamarin Forms on Windows, and that's great as well. And now we're like really bringing it to the Mac as well. So it's again, this goes to all this is .NET code, and yeah, it is tricky to integrate into a different IDE and all that, but that's like 5 to 10% of the work. The 90% of the work is in the engine itself and all the quirks of XAML that we need to deal with. All that just becomes shared code, and that's fantastic.
This is an important part of our developer community that contribute back to the Microsoft ecosystem and are part of the community as well. I'm glad you are the gardener of Visual Studio for Mac.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be working on this product. It's in some ways, I'd always use the Mac as on the side, so to speak. I'd never developed on the Mac, so it was a pretty good learning experience for me as well. And knowing how far along the product was, it was eye-opening. Like you could do a .NET Core on the Mac, and it was consistent to VS Windows. When I came into the team, that was the state we were in, and that was fantastic. And now it's just polishing up and catching up a little bit on the debt that we'd accrued, and hopefully we can make .NET really awesome on the Mac.
Let's make Visual Studio and .NET really awesome on the Mac.
That's it. That's the phrase.
Unni, thanks for being on the call today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Jerry. I'm looking forward to doing this sometime again in the near future.
So are we.